There was a stillness to the mountains of Kandahar that didn't feel natural. It wasn't the silence of peace, or the quiet of snowfall, or even the eerie hush that follows a firefight. This was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around the bones of the land, the kind that pressed against your chest like altitude, thin and ancient. For the men hiking through that ridge at sunrise, it gnawed at their nerves like frostbite, quiet at first, but growing unbearable the longer it was ignored. Sergeant Daniel McAllister was the first to say it out loud. "You feel that?" he muttered, pausing to scan the ridgeline above. His voice was low, muffled by the scarf wrapped around his mouth. Not even the wind responded. No birds. No goat herders. Just the crunch of gravel under combat boots and the soft electronic hiss of radios that hadn't said a word in nearly an hour. Staff Sergeant Hale didn't answer right away. He just stopped beside McAllister, his eyes tracing the jagged black silhouette of the cave entrance a few hundred meters ahead. Had been staring at it since they crested the slope 10 minutes ago. It was too symmetrical, too perfectly shadowed, like a wound in the mountain, not a natural formation. "Yeah," Hale finally said. "I feel it." Behind them, the rest of the squad moved in a tight, cautious line. 6 men. A tight recon unit, pulled from 2 teams after the original patrol, Echo 7, went dark 3 days prior. No comms. No GPS signal. Not even a last-ditch beacon flare. Just gone. The mission was clear: find Echo 7. Or what was left of them. McAllister had just the grip on his M4, scanning the ground. The terrain here was unforgiving, rocky and steep, every step a gamble against twisted ankles or worse. But it was more than the climb that made his hands sweat. There were signs. Gear. Bits of it. A torn pouch. A single boot. One glove, fingers stiff from freeze and time. All American issue. Fresh. He had been in the sandbox long enough to know what IED aftermath looked like. This wasn't that. No scorch marks. No fragmentation. Just things. Dropped. Scattered. Like the men had vanished mid-step. Hale raised a hand. Everyone froze. He pointed with 2 fingers, then gestured downward. 30 meters ahead, half buried under dust and loose rock, something glinted. Private Diaz was the first to reach it. He crouched, brushing off the debris slowly, methodically. Then he cursed under his breath. It was a helmet. The name stenciled on the back, E. Sanders. Echo 7. McAllister took a step forward, then froze. His nostrils flared. "Jesus," he muttered. The smell hit them all at once. Rank. Sweet. Thick like motor oil and rotting meat, but older. Ancient. Something dead and yet wrong. They turned toward the source. The entrance to the cave yawned before them now, wide and black and still. No wind emerged. No sound. Just darkness and the creeping sense of something watching. Waiting. Bones lay outside the entrance, bleached and tangled like driftwood. Not arranged. Not hidden. Just there. Some clearly animal, goat, dog maybe, but others. Longer. Rib cages too big. Femurs the wrong thickness. Fragments of what might have once been helmets or vests. Shattered and tossed aside like trash. Private Novak gagged and turned away. Then came the voice. It wasn't clear at first, just a vibration. Low and guttural. It rolled out from the cave like a growl made of rock and breath. Then came the sound of something moving. Something massive. Gravel shifted. A heavy scrape echoed across the slope. Contact. Hale barked, raising his weapon. But it was already too late. From the darkness, it stepped out. 13 feet, maybe more. Covered in mottled skins and dust, hair long and red and tangled like roots. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the filtered sunlight, yellow and feral. Its hands were massive, and in one was a spear, primitive, but sturdy, carved from some ancient wood. It smelled like blood, rot, and ash. And it was running at them. Time collapsed. The world became movement, instinct, and adrenaline. The first man didn't even scream. The spear impaled him mid-shout, lifting him from the ground like a rag doll. The sound it made, wet, final, too loud in the dead air, froze the rest of the team for half a second. Then the shouting began. Engage! Engage! Gunfire exploded across the ridge. Muzzle flashes stuttered in the thin air. The giant roared, a sound that seemed to shake the stones beneath their boots. Rounds slammed into its chest, neck, face, but it kept coming. Until finally, it didn't. 30 seconds of pure firepower dropped it. Knees buckled. It stumbled, fell forward, and didn't rise again. Silence returned, but not peace. The body lay at the cave's threshold, steaming in the cold air. Blood, dark, too dark, pooled beneath it. McAllister, breathing hard, approached slowly, rifle still trained. Then he saw the hand. 6 fingers. Thick, calloused, each nail like a blade. Is it human? Diaz whispered, stepping closer. No one answered. Behind them, the mountain held its breath. Far above, a raven let out a single, lonely caw, then flew off into the emptiness. Somewhere back in the cave, something else shifted. The silence returned. But now, it wasn't empty. It was expectant. Waiting for who would come next. Afghanistan has never been easy to describe. Maps can tell you where the mountains are, but they won't tell you what they feel like. You won't find the pressure of ancient silence, the weight of blood in the dirt, or the taste of dust that sticks to the roof of your mouth no matter how many times you spit. You won't hear the wind howl through the passes like it's trying to remember the names of the dead. To understand Afghanistan, the real Afghanistan, you have to stand in it. You have to watch the light crawl across the jagged ridgelines like something wounded, dragging its way toward dusk. You have to breathe in the cold, the kind that makes your nose sting and your lungs feel like they're being slowly etched with glass. And you have to know that every stone beneath your boot, every shadow that slips between the rocks, has a memory older than anything you've ever lived. It's no wonder the locals say this land remembers everything. The mountains of Kandahar aren't just topography, they're a kind of fortress. Impenetrable. Primeval. And for thousands of years, they've kept secrets. In the wake of 9/11, when the world watched the Twin Towers fall and everything changed in a matter of hours, those same mountains became one of the first frontiers in the war on terror. It started with Operation Enduring Freedom, an aggressive push by the United States and coalition forces to unseat the Taliban regime. The campaign kicked off in October 2001, with the goal of flushing out al-Qaeda operatives believed to be hiding under the Taliban's protection. But as the tanks rolled in and airstrikes lit up the horizon, the enemy didn't vanish, they moved. They slipped from the cities into the highlands. Into the mountains. And in doing so, they stepped into territory that even modern armies still struggle to conquer. Ask any soldier who served in Afghanistan, and they'll tell you the same thing: terrain is the enemy you never quite beat. GPS is flaky in the mountains. Drones lose signal. Even satellite comms get fuzzy in the valleys. The moment you leave the wire and push into the high ground, it's like stepping into a different century. One where your boots matter more than your tech, and your instincts better be sharper than your sensors. So, when word came down about a team gone missing in the remote outskirts of Kandahar, no signal, no trace, nothing, command knew exactly what they were up against. Not just insurgents. Not just terrain. Isolation. Because out there, help doesn't come fast. In fact, it often doesn't come at all. The mission to locate that missing unit, Echo 7, was labeled Standard Reconnaissance with Recovery Potential. But the men assigned to the operation knew better. It was a recovery op. Maybe not even that. Maybe just a confirmation op. A way to collect dog tags and make sense of another patch of red on the map. But what they didn't expect, what none of them could have prepared for, was what they'd find when they got there. Before Echo 7 went dark, they'd been running a search and destroy pattern along the outer shelf of the mountain range, following intel that suggested Taliban forces were storing weapons in a nearby cave system. This kind of operation wasn't uncommon. Clear, confirm, collapse. Move on. The mission design was familiar: insertion by hello, patrol, sweep, and extraction. But Echo 7 never made their call in. And when their beacon failed to activate, HQ knew something was wrong. The replacement unit was pulled from 2 active Special Forces detachments already in the area, men with experience in high-altitude ops and cave warfare. Their orders were simple: locate Echo 7, assess the situation, and report findings. If possible, recover the team. If not, return with whatever information could be salvaged. They dropped into the mountain under cover of night. A moonless sky. The kind of black that eats light. The air was thin and sharp. The team moved without chatter, boots crunching softly over frozen gravel. Each man carried not just a rifle, but the unspoken weight of what had happened to Echo 7. They found the first sign of trouble just after dawn. A discarded comms pack. Ripped open. Still functional, but no signal. Nearby, boot prints. Scattered. Erratic. Not a firefight. Not an ambush. More like a stampede. But that didn't make sense. No shell casings. No blood trail. No sign of struggle. Just abandoned equipment and an eerie absence of anything else. The trail led them toward the edge of the ravine, where the rocks formed a natural funnel into a series of canyons. And deeper still, a cave mouth, unnaturally wide, partially obscured by brush and stone. It didn't match any map records. Not even the classified ones. That's when they began to smell it. Something foul. Musky. Like sweat and rot and old smoke. It didn't belong to the wind, and it didn't belong to any animal they knew. It was heavier. It clung to the fabric of their uniforms. It soaked into the air. The men tightened formation. Fingers on triggers. Eyes tracking movement where there was none. And yet, they felt watched. This was more than enemy territory. More than a lost patrol. There was something else here. Something no one had planned for. The locals had warned them, of course. Villagers, elders, even the children, they spoke of old things in the mountains. Pale ones, they'd called them. Tall ones. Spirits of vengeance. Hungry ghosts. Men who were not men. But soldiers don't plan for ghosts. They plan for bullets, and bombs, and bad intel. And now, as they stood at the edge of that ancient wound in the earth, staring into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow thought, a few of them remembered those stories. And wondered. What exactly had Echo 7 walked into? What had they seen? And, more pressingly, what still waited there, deep in the silence, watching the next group of men step forward? The American military had conquered no shortage of cities. It had razed compounds. It had cracked bunkers and leveled caves. But this was something else. Afghanistan had been called many things over the centuries. A graveyard of empires. A battlefield of ideologies. But for the men standing there, in that pale dawn light, breathing in the cold stink of something ancient and wrong, it was a place that didn't just fight back. It remembered. And it was waiting. The first sign was silence. Not the quiet of a mission going according to plan. Not even the absence of radio chatter during a blackout period. No, This was the kind of silence that makes seasoned men glance over their shoulders for no reason, the kind that creeps in like fog, seeping through your gear and lodging itself behind your ribs. An absence that presses in. Echo 7 had missed their scheduled check-in. Then they missed the backup window. And then the fail-safe. Command didn't panic, not outwardly. Comms go dark sometimes. Bad terrain, bad weather, bad tech. But everyone in the ops center felt the tension. An entire team doesn't just vanish, not in Kandahar, not with the gear they carried, and certainly not with the strict recon parameters they were assigned. A second team was mobilized before the sun hit the peaks. 12 men. Special Operations Composite. Pulled from active units already deployed nearby. They were briefed quickly, efficiently. Echo 7's last known position, suspected Taliban activity, terrain analysis, mission scope. Officially, they were there to recover intel and, if necessary, remains. Unofficially, everyone in that room knew what this was. Something had gone very, very wrong. The insertion went smooth. Too smooth, some of the men later recalled. Chinook in under the cover of pre-dawn. Drop point clear. No heat signatures in the valley. No contacts. No gunfire. Just the slow, eerie descent into shadowed terrain as the rotors faded into distance. The new team moved fast and tight, boots crunching over frost-hardened gravel, rifles at the ready. The air was crisp and thin, high-altitude air that scraped the back of your throat and made you feel like you hadn't really breathed in days. Above them, the cliffs rose like the bones of the earth, towering slabs of granite streaked with wind-burnt snow. They followed Echo 7's last trajectory up into the crags. That's when they started finding pieces. At first, it was just small things, a snapped strap. A broken carabiner. A canteen left upright, its cap unscrewed. Things that could have been dropped, overlooked in a hasty movement or abandoned during a firefight. But there were no shell casings. No blood. And the gear was scattered. Not in a pile. Not in a line. But across a stretch of rock like someone had walked and evaporated in pieces. Like the mountain had chewed them up, then spit out only what it didn't want. Corporal Ames was the first to notice the oddity. He picked up a helmet, still intact, but the interior padding was soaked, not with blood but with something else. A sticky, foul-smelling residue. Not fuel. Not dirt. Something biological. Smells like rot, he muttered. Like something dead, Sergeant Finch said beside him, lowering his rifle slightly. But not recently dead. They pushed forward. 10 minutes later, they found the first real sign. It was wedged between two jagged rocks, half a radio pack. The antenna was bent, wires exposed. The casing had been crushed. Not exploded. Not torn. Crushed. The pressure required to do that kind of damage would have required industrial machinery, or something bigger than a man. They fanned out, scanning the area. One of the scouts called in from the ridge above. Contact, visual, he hissed through the mic, northwest slope. Gear. Multiple fragments. You're gonna want to see this. They climbed. What they found there shifted the tone of the entire mission. Bits of uniform. Torn, shredded in irregular ways. One boot, lace missing. Pieces of a plate carrier, the ceramic inserts shattered like pottery. A set of dog tags, twisted and bent. The serial number was still readable. Echo 7. And then, the trail. Shreds of fabric. Blood. Something that looked like fingernails. A scatter of things across the rock as if someone had tried to escape, had run, stumbled, fought. But the tracks were bizarre. Uneven. One set would move in a straight line, then vanish. Another pair, smaller, followed behind, then abruptly dragged sideways. And beyond it all, up a steep incline half hidden by fallen stone and dried brush, the dark mouth of a cave. They didn't move right away. Something about the entrance held them. It wasn't just the shape, broad, unnaturally symmetrical, as though carved, not eroded. It was the feeling that radiated from it. Cold. Still. As if the cave knew they were coming. There was no wildlife. Not a single sound except for the wind slicing between the ridges. Staff Sergeant Hale moved first, raising a fist to signal silence. They advanced as a unit, spacing wide across the rocky plateau, rifles up, eyes flicking toward movement that never came. Just shadow and wind. And bones. The area outside the cave was littered with them. Some bleached by sun. Others fresh, too fresh. Bits of tendon still clinging. Patches of cloth stuck to cracked femurs. A helmet wedged under a pile of rib bones, crushed like an eggshell. Someone had died here. More than one. The bones weren't buried. They weren't arranged. They were discarded. McAllister whispered under his breath. Something ate them. Hale didn't respond. He was staring at something further down the slope, a dark, oblong shape lying just beyond the rock outcrop. They approached cautiously. It was a body. What remained of one? Torn open from clavicle to hip. The chest cavity hollowed. The limbs broken in unnatural ways, one of the arms twisted completely backward, fingers bent like claws. And the head, it was missing. Nearby, they found the spear. Long nearly 7 feet in length. Hand-carved, polished smooth by time or use. The shaft wrapped in strips of sinew. The point was metal, but not forged. Sharpened from a chunk of something ancient. Weathered. Old. Not Taliban. Not anything they'd seen in this war. Finch moved to signal back to HQ. No, Hale said suddenly. His voice was low but sharp. We stay dark. Until we know what's in there. They moved to cover. Set perimeter. The air seemed to change as they watched the cave. Heavier. Still. It was Diaz who saw it first. A flicker of movement. Just at the edge of the cave's black mouth. A shift. A flick of red in the shadows. Then came the growl. Not a sound from an animal. Not from a man. A resonance. A guttural vibration that made the earth hum and their bones tremble. The kind of sound that belongs to old things, things that don't care about the shape of your weapon or the rank on your chest. And then it stepped out. It was massive. Not just tall, massive. 13 feet, maybe more. Shoulders like slabs of mountain. Hair wild, red, matted. Skin pale, but streaked with dirt and blood. Its chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately. Eyes deep set. Not glowing. Not inhuman. But ancient. The creature carried another spear, this one stained with something dark. Its gaze passed over the men slowly. Deliberately. And then it charged. There was no war cry. No roar. Just motion. Blinding, brutal motion. The first man didn't even scream. The spear impaled him, lifted him. The body twisted midair before slamming into a rock with a wet crack. Then the gunfire started. Automatic bursts lit the rocks. The air filled with dust, thunder, and the stench of cordite. The creature staggered, absorbed round after round. It reached out with one massive arm and threw, a boulder, maybe, or part of the mountain itself. It missed. Barely. For 30 seconds, the world was chaos. Then, finally, the thing dropped. Smoke rose from its wounds. Its blood was thick and dark, almost black, almost tar. The corpse shuddered, once, and was still. Nobody spoke. They stood there, panting, half deaf from the noise, half mad from the sight. And around them, the mountains were silent once more. Watching. Waiting. They thought it was over. After the gunfire died down and the creature's massive frame collapsed at the cave's mouth, the team stood frozen, half in shock, half in disbelief. It had been 30, maybe 40 seconds of chaos. A firestorm of lead, fear, and adrenaline. And now, in its wake, the quiet returned, not peace, but an uneasy stillness. A vacuum where sound had been. No one spoke for a long time. The giant's body steamed in the frigid morning air, a mix of black, syrupy blood and the reek of something ancient and unclean rising around them. It was a smell that burned the nostrils, part rot, part musk, part earth, as if the creature had been born from the soil itself, dug up from some forgotten graveyard at the edge of human memory. Sergeant Hale was the first to move. He approached slowly, rifle still trained, boots crunching lightly against the frosted stone. Each step forward was deliberate, not just cautious but reverent, like approaching the altar of something sacred and violent. Something you weren't supposed to look at for too long. Up close, the size was even more staggering. 13 feet at least, maybe more if it had stood fully upright. Its chest had collapsed under the hail of gunfire, riddled with entry wounds and blood that didn't shimmer like human blood. It clotted almost instantly, like sap from a dead tree. The skin was pale but thick, like cured leather, stretched across corded muscle and bone. Its teeth, visible now through parted, cracked lips, were not just double-rowed, but jagged, chipped like stone tools. And the eyes. Open. Not glazed over in death. Not fully closed, either. Open just enough to suggest awareness. Memory. Even now. Jesus Christ, McAllister whispered behind Hale, his voice trembling. We actually, don't, Hale cut in, sharp. Don't say it. Not yet. They needed a sitrep. A medevac. Something. But no one moved to call it in. The radios suddenly felt fragile in their hands, like toys, like trying to shout into the Grand Canyon and expecting a reply. Instead, they began documenting. Diaz, still pale from the encounter, retrieved the squad's ruggedized camera unit. He started snapping photos automatically, habit, protocol, but his hands shook the entire time. McAllister took notes, writing quickly in shorthand, his words barely legible. Finch stood guard near the entrance, scanning the shadows in the cave with narrowed eyes. The cave still held that breathless stillness. The kind that felt alive. I don't think it was alone, Finch said suddenly. He hadn't turned around. You see the bones? Scattered wide. Different sizes. Some fresher than others. That's not one kill. That's a history. A long pause followed. No one disagreed. They secured the area as best they could, setting up a loose perimeter around the cave mouth. The slope was too narrow for a full sweep, and the overhang above them made comms risky. Still, they did what they could, trip lines, signal flares, fallback points. And then they waited. It took nearly 4 hours for extraction to arrive. When the rumble of rotors finally echoed across the ridgeline, no one felt relief. The Chinook appeared as a black silhouette in the gray light, flanked by 2 Apache escorts. It hovered low, kicking up a whirlwind of dust and pebbles before touching down a few hundred meters away. Out stepped a recovery unit, for additional operators, geared to the teeth, but the way they looked at the body said everything. They hadn't come prepared for this. They brought harnessing equipment. Pallets. Rigging. Industrial tarps. And without a word, they began the grim process of securing the giant's corpse for transport. The process was slow. The creature's body didn't move like a man's, it was heavier, denser. They had to lash the limbs down tightly, curling it into a fetal position just to fit it on the 463L cargo pallet. As they worked, the stench only grew worse. Diaz eventually gagged and pulled away, dry heaving behind a rock. By the time the Chinook lifted off again, the sun had risen to its zenith. Harsh light bled across the valley, revealing the path of destruction left behind. Blood trails. Shattered bones. A battlefield of myth carved into the side of a mountain. And still, no one talked about what they'd seen. At base, the debrief was clinical. Cold. Mechanical. Each man was pulled in individually. A single room. One table. Two men in uniforms without name tags. Questions came rapid fire. Precise. They didn't ask what the soldiers felt. Only what they saw. What they heard. What they touched. When the debrief was over, each man was handed a document. Standard military non-disclosure agreement, top secret, signed under penalty of court-martial. Lifetime silence. No one was surprised. It was as if they'd been expecting it. Still, the act of signing felt heavy. Not because they feared punishment, but because what they had seen didn't belong to the realm of ordinary memory. It didn't belong to paper. To language. It belonged to myth. And it was not yet finished. The first sign that something had gone wrong with the body came 48 hours later. Diaz woke up vomiting. A low-grade fever, persistent nausea, night terrors. Then Finch. Then Ames. The medics chalked it up to stress, to the altitude, to exposure to unfamiliar bacteria from the cave. But nothing they prescribed worked. Then Hale got the call. The body was gone. Not destroyed. Not lost. Gone. No records of it arriving at Wright-Patterson. No chain of custody reports. The flight log from the Chinook had been redacted. The pilots reassigned. The rigging crew split up and shipped out to different installations. As if the entire operation had been fractured and scattered like breadcrumbs. When Hale pushed for answers, he hit stone walls. All records had been sealed. Higher clearance required. Need to know. He didn't. But someone did. Because a few days after the call, he received a letter. Not an email. A physical letter, typed on unmarked paper, no return address. It contained a name. Mr. K. No other details. But the implication was clear, there was someone else who knew. What followed next was not a military operation. It was a search. Quiet. Off the books. Hale reached out through informal channels, former operators, retired analysts, civilian contractors who owed him favors. It took weeks. Months. But eventually, patterns emerged. Stories. Whispers. Not just from Kandahar. From Kunar. From Nuristan. From valleys no longer marked on NATO maps. Drone operators who reported seeing heat signatures the size of buildings. Intel analysts who swore they saw things walking through IR footage that didn't line up with any known human physiology. Locals who talked about pale men in the hills who weren't men at all. And then Hale got the video. Unmarked drive. No metadata. The footage was grainy, low resolution. A stationary drone feed. Nighttime surveillance. A small clearing in the woods, ringed with crude shelters. And in the middle, figures. Large. Slow-moving. One of them bent down to stoke a fire. The heat signature flared on screen. It wasn't just big. It was massive. And it walked like it wasn't in a hurry. Like it wasn't afraid. Like it had never been afraid. Hale watched it on loop for hours. He studied the shape. The gait. The proportions. It matched. Almost exactly. The creature from Kandahar. But this one was alive. The escalation wasn't one moment. It wasn't a firefight or a bombing run or a failed extraction. It was a realization. That the thing they killed wasn't alone. That maybe it wasn't even rare. And worse, that someone knew. Someone had known for a long time. The stories didn't stop. More testimonies surfaced, quiet, anonymous accounts posted on message boards or leaked through channels no one openly trusted. Stories of giants in the highlands. Creatures that hunted in the dark. Villagers who dyed their goats red and left them tied to tree trunks under the full moon. Not out of ritual. Out of fear. Out of tribute. Hale didn't sleep much after that. He kept a log of it all. Notes. Maps. Patterns. He tried to build something cohesive. Something he could hold up and say, this is proof. But the more he dug, the more the ground seemed to fall away beneath him. Because the mountain wasn't just a place. It was a veil. And something was waiting behind it. Still watching. Still listening. Still remembering. The first time Hale heard another voice say it out loud, giants, it didn't come from a soldier. It came from a drone technician. She was young, mid-20s maybe. Quiet. One of those contract hires who spent most of her hours in cold metal rooms watching heat signatures move like ghosts across black and white screens. Hale had tracked her down after finding her name attached to 2 archived flight logs marked anomalous movement, inconclusive. They met in a coffee shop on base, neutral ground, fluorescent lighting, the kind of place where people went to not talk about what they'd seen. But she did. She pulled her cap lower on her brow, kept her voice low. I don't know what it was, she said, but I've seen bears move. I've seen camels, horses, people running through poppy fields, kids chasing goats. This wasn't any of those. What was it doing? Hale asked. Standing. Then walking. One stride covered, I don't know. 20 meters. Maybe more. No sway. Just mass. Like it was carved out of the mountain. He asked if she reported it. She laughed. Bitter. No one wants to hear that. You get a reputation. Your feed gets triple-checked. Eventually, you don't get fed anything worth checking. She slid a USB across the table, wrapped in a napkin. I saved one clip, she said. Wasn't supposed to. But I did. He didn't open it in the shop. He waited until he was alone. The footage was short, no more than 15 seconds. But it was unmistakable. A silhouette. Humanoid. Massive. It crossed a ravine in 4 steps, pausing once to look, directly, toward the drone camera before the feed cut to static. Not an animal. Not a trick of light. It knew it was being watched. More accounts came in from unexpected places. A British Royal Marine, stationed in Helmand, spoke of something watching us from the peaks. His squad had lost 2 men during a night patrol, no shots fired, no bodies found, only a trail of red-dyed cloth the local shepherds claimed wasn't theirs. An Australian officer posted in Uruzgan described using thermal optics to scan distant compounds at night, spotting what looked like a man. Until he realized the man was standing behind a 2-story wall. Had to double-check the rangefinder, he said in his report. Thing was over 1,800 meters out. And still clear. That meant it had to be huge. I never told anyone. Figured it was a glitch. Or that I was tired. But I haven't forgotten. Then came a cluster of testimonies from Kunduz province, a place known to American units as a kill zone, but known to locals by an older name, Land of the Shadow Men. There, UAV operators began reporting thermal ghosts, massive, transient heat signatures that appeared and vanished with no obvious movement. Not vehicles. Not fires. They didn't move like enemy groups. They moved like predators. And then came something new. A low-resolution clip of an IR camera watching a group of figures huddled around a campfire. Nothing strange, until a 4th shape emerged from the trees, bent low, stepped over the fire, and picked one of the men up with one hand. The feed cut out. The next day, that patrol failed to report back. The following week, the file disappeared from the internal server. Back in Kandahar, villagers stopped talking. At first, they were helpful. Curious. Eager to explain things to the foreign soldiers asking strange questions. But when Hale's team returned, after the cave, after the firefight, there was a shift. Men who had previously smiled now looked away. Elders refused to translate. One village imam quietly pressed a folded scrap of cloth into Hale's palm, bright red, knotted in a pattern Hale didn't recognize. For protection, the interpreter translated. He says the mountains remember your scent now. When Hale asked what that meant, the imam replied without looking up, you bled something that was not meant to be bled. And then came the disappearances. Not of soldiers. Of stories. One by one, blog posts vanished. Archived forum threads returned 404 errors. Uploaded video links failed to play. Even news articles, legitimate ones, published in 2022 by military digest sites, were quietly edited or removed. In their place, silence. The digital equivalent of dust settling over a sealed vault. But some people noticed. Journalists. Independent researchers. Retired officers. And they started whispering something that felt both absurd and horrifying. It wasn't just one. The giant of Kandahar was just the first, or at least, the first caught. Others had been spotted for decades. Centuries, even. And not just in Afghanistan. North America. Eastern Europe. The Himalayas. Places where the land still held echoes of its oldest inhabitants. Places where entire towns had vanished, only to be replaced by legends of devourers or skywalkers or bone eaters. One photograph, never confirmed, emerged on a private server frequented by ex-Intel analysts. Grainy. Unstable. A figure crouching beside a glacier shelf in northern Pakistan. Its shoulders were broader than a Land Rover. It held a goat in one hand. The goat was screaming. The creature was not. Hale began to suspect what others were too afraid to say, what they'd seen wasn't an anomaly. It was a pattern. A species. A hidden population. Not myth. Not metaphor. But real. And worse, adaptive. Camouflaged by culture. By denial. By the vast, dismissive machinery of modern warfare that refused to accept anything not on a list of known threats. The world had moved on. But the mountains had not. They had waited. And something in them had survived. Still breathing. Still eating. Still watching from the ridges. Waiting for silence to fall again. That was when Hale stopped investigating. He wasn't told to. No one threatened him. But one day, every contact he'd made disconnected. Phones went dead. Emails bounced. Physical letters were returned unopened. The USB drives had stored in separate locations, redundant backups, were wiped. His security clearance was quietly downgraded. And one morning, he woke up to find his backdoor access to classified archives gone. Just gone. Like someone had quietly erased not just the evidence, but his ability to look. But he remembered. Every second. The feel of that air in the cave. The look on Diaz's face. The sound of the spear going through Finch's armor like paper. The weight of that silence afterward. It never left him. And sometimes, late at night, with the window cracked and the wind howling across the trees, he'd smell it again. That stench. Like rot and old earth. And he'd wonder if they had followed him. If they'd marked him. If, even now, something was standing just beyond the tree line. Watching. Waiting. Because if what he'd seen was real, and it was, then the mountains weren't finished. Not by a long shot. They were just beginning to speak. And this time, they weren't whispering. They were calling back. The investigation didn't start with a plan. It started with a question, or rather, a series of unspoken ones that gnawed at Hale the moment his feet hit the tarmac at Kandahar. He could feel them in the weight of the air, in the eerie silence after the gunfire had stopped. His eyes, trained to find patterns in chaos, didn't settle on the bodies or the scattered wreckage from the operation. Instead, they fixed on the cave, the yawning mouth of it that had swallowed Echo 7, that had birthed something monstrous. How long had it been there? How long had it been waiting? What other horrors could those mountains hide, lurking in the shadows that no light could pierce? Hale didn't want to acknowledge the panic that had begun clawing at the edges of his thoughts. But every time he closed his eyes, he could see the body, the giant, too clearly. Not just the height or the grotesque shape of it, but its eyes, how they hadn't died. Not like an animal. Not like a man. No. They had lingered, looking back at him from that half-dead skull, full of ancient awareness. That was the real terror. Not the creature itself, but the unshakable feeling that they were never meant to encounter it. That something had been disturbed. They hadn't just killed an anomaly. They had woken up something that had been sleeping for a long, long time. The first step of the investigation was simple: interviews. Witness accounts, field reports, anything that could shed light on what had happened during Echo 7's final moments. But it wasn't the soldiers' reports that made Hale's pulse quicken, it was the silence. The way every soldier spoke of it in hushed tones, careful to stick to the facts. No one talked about what they'd felt standing in front of that creature. No one mentioned the way the air felt too heavy, too thick, as if the mountains themselves were alive. They didn't mention the way their hands trembled after the firefight, the way their eyes darted to the cave, to the ridgelines, every time they heard a distant sound, as if they were expecting something else to emerge. The reports were clinical. Detached. The giant had been a threat, and it had been neutralized. End of story. But Hale wasn't satisfied. Not yet. So, he began digging deeper. He spent days sifting through every scrap of intel, every debriefing, every bit of digital evidence he could get his hands on. And it was in the cold, sterile data where he found the first thread, the drone footage. It was taken from a UAV flying high above the cave system, well out of enemy range. The footage was clear, unremarkable at first. Soldiers moving through the valley. The occasional flock of birds scattering in panic. But at the moment of the encounter, the brief, haunting moment when the creature first stepped from the cave, the footage did something strange. It cut out. For just a few seconds. But those few seconds were all Hale needed. He spent hours replaying the glitch, zooming in on the part of the footage just before the signal cut. At first, it looked like static, distortion. But then, in that moment just before the screen went black, he saw something. A shape. It was massive. Something beyond human, beyond animal. The giant. It was real. The confirmation rattled him more than it should have. Had suspected it. Of course, he had. But seeing the outline, that fleeting glimpse of it, a figure so large it seemed to consume the terrain around it, shifted something deep inside him. This is real, he thought. And with that realization, the investigation wasn't just about finding answers, it became about survival. Because if the government had covered this up, if the truth was buried with the giant, then it was bigger than any one mission, any one unit. And if something so ancient could survive out there in the mountains, what else was hiding in the dark? Days blurred into weeks as Hale pushed forward, refusing to let the unanswered questions slip through his fingers. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces started to fit into something far darker than anyone had considered. The military reports, the testimonies from the soldiers, the strange patterns in the flight logs, the silences where there should have been answers, they all pointed toward one undeniable truth: the giant wasn't the first. It was a species. One of many. The mountain wasn't just a graveyard of the dead. It was a sanctuary. The more Hale learned, the more the puzzle pieces began to form. There were whispers. Old rumors, often dismissed by seasoned officers as ghost stories or local folklore. Tales of tall men in the hills, of pale giants who lived by their own rules, of strange offerings left in the dead of night. But these stories weren't confined to the dusty corners of Afghan villages or the annals of tribal myth, they existed on a much broader scale. The deeper Hale went, the more global the phenomenon became. And it was only then that he began to piece together what had happened to Echo 7. The moment they entered that cave, they hadn't just stumbled into a Taliban hideout. They had walked into the heart of a forgotten world. A world of ancient creatures that had been left to live, or, worse, to wait, while the rest of humanity moved on. Hale had a theory now. A chilling one. The giant had been there for a reason. It had been guarding something. And when Echo 7 ventured too close, when they got too near the center of its territory, it had attacked. Not out of hunger. Not out of malice. But out of protection. The investigation didn't stop with just the soldiers. Hale reached out to former contacts, some in the intelligence community, others in the private sector. One of his old informants, a civilian contractor who had worked with UAVs for decades, came through with a shocking discovery. The data files, the ones Hale had thought were wiped, hadn't just been erased, they had been rerouted. They led to a hidden server, one buried in a military facility on the outskirts of Nevada. Hale didn't know how to explain it, but he felt the weight of it in his gut. This was no mistake. Someone had meant for him to find this. The server contained satellite images, thermal footage, and even classified military documentation from other operations. And hidden within those files were references to other giants, other sightings of humanoid creatures at the edges of war zones, locations as far-flung as Siberia, the Amazon, and the Himalayas. But the most chilling piece of evidence came from a small, encrypted file buried deep within the server. It was labeled, Project Titan. No one had ever heard of it. It was an old research project. One that had been shut down almost a decade ago. But the files pointed to something new. The project wasn't about finding or fighting the giants, it was about studying them. Understanding their biology. Their behaviors. And the implications were clear. The giants weren't just survivors. They were evolving. The more Hale uncovered, the more the world around him seemed to crumble. It wasn't just a matter of ancient creatures and military cover-ups, it was the control of the narrative, of the secrets too dangerous for the public to know. By the time Hale pulled the last string, by the time he thought he understood the truth, he was too deep into the rabbit hole to turn back. And that was when the warnings began. He received a package, no return address, no note. Just a single photo, printed on flimsy paper. It was the face of the giant, but not the one from Kandahar. This one was older. Its skin was paler, almost translucent. It stared back at him, eyes empty but knowing. And around the edges of the photo were dates. Coordinates. And a final message, typed neatly at the bottom, "They're coming." Hale didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But he was beginning to suspect that the giants weren't the only thing lurking in the shadows. And if they were coming, then the investigation was far from over. The truth didn't come all at once. It came in fragments. A line buried in a decades-old transmission log. A grainy interview posted to a conspiracy forum, then quietly deleted. A single redacted name in a Cold War archive that matched a recent classified file. Each piece was insignificant on its own. Disconnected. Fragile. But together, they painted something terrifyingly clear. The creature Hale's team killed in Kandahar wasn't an outlier. It was a remnant. And worse, it had been encountered before. The revelation came from an unlikely source. A December 2008 broadcast of Coast to Coast AM, a late-night radio show famous for fringe theories and alien callings. On that particular night, a man identifying only as a CH-47 pilot was interviewed. His voice was calm, professional. Not the kind of hysteria Hale expected when he first heard the clip. "I didn't see it alive," the pilot said, "but I saw it on the pallet. Dead. Covered in tarp and blood and stink you'll never forget." He described the same creature Hale had seen, same 6 fingers, same massive frame, same stench. The voice crackled faintly through static, and we weren't allowed to ask questions, the pilot continued. "Just get it out of the mountains. Fly low. Keep quiet." The date he gave? Spring of 2002. 6 months before Hale's own mission. That was the first crack in the foundation. Because it meant there had been 2 separate encounters. The testimony wasn't alone. Hale tracked down mirrored archives, screenshots from message boards, recordings stored in private collections. Then came Mr. K. He appeared in a video uploaded in 2016, only to disappear from the internet days later. Hale found a surviving copy buried on a military interest blog, its author long since inactive. The video quality was poor. Lit by a single bulb, the man who called himself Mr. K sat hunched forward in a folding chair, voice low, eyes heavy. "I was there," he said. "Part of the retrieval team. Not the first. Not the last." The details he gave were specific, not just about the encounter, but about what followed. "The thing killed one of our guys with a spear," Mr. K said. "Lifted him off the ground like a rag. We hit it with everything, M4s, saws, grenades. Wouldn't go down." His voice dropped, strained with memory. "When it finally dropped, we thought it was over. We were wrong. Command showed up in under 2 hours. Not standard. Not army. Suits. Told us to shut up. Told us it was a mass hallucination due to environmental factors. Then they took the body. Gone. Never saw it again." There was a pause. A silence so long, Hale thought the video had frozen. Then Mr. K looked directly at the camera. "They told us it was classified biological intelligence. CBI. Not Taliban. Not insurgent. Indigenous species of interest. Been here longer than us," they said. The words hung like smoke. Indigenous species. Not a cryptid. Not a myth. Not a ghost story whispered by tired soldiers in high-altitude bivouacs. But a native predator. Hale sat frozen, the words drilling into him like cold iron. It wasn't just that they had fought something unknown. It was that someone knew. And had known, for decades. Everything changed after that. Because now Hale had a timeline. Not just of encounters, but of containment. Whispers of a long-defunct division buried deep in the intelligence community, Project Titan. Supposedly launched during the Cold War, when early satellite imaging picked up anomalies in uninhabited mountainous regions, anomalies shaped like humans, but too large. Too fast. Too strange. Files referenced prehistoric hominid variants, territorial gigantism, and, chillingly, behavioral mimicry protocols. It wasn't that the giants had evolved like animals. It was that they had learned. They knew how to hide. They understood human movement. They observed from shadows, cave systems, abandoned valleys, and when threatened, they struck with precision. And in 2002, Echo 7 had crossed a line. What Hale didn't expect was what came next. Testimonies started appearing in strange places, comment threads, old forums, email inboxes with no sender. Soldiers, drone pilots, recon officers. People who had seen things, but been told to forget them. They shared stories of figures taller than rooftops moving through snow at night. Of unmapped caves that smelled of rot and death. Of creatures carrying crude tools, spears, clubs, stone blades, almost ceremonial in design. One account stood out. A former FMV analyst, full motion video, who had been stationed in Afghanistan between 2012 and 2014. His job had been to analyze drone feeds for patterns of life. That meant watching hours of villagers going about their routines, logging movements, spotting insurgents based on subtle behavior. But one night, the feed captured something different. At first, it looked like two men huddled under a blanket near a fire. But then one of them stood up. All at once. As one shape. And it wasn't two men. It was one. 8 or 9 feet tall, moving with unnatural fluidity, it ducked into a mud hut, bending almost in half to fit through the doorframe. The analyst never told anyone. Until now. Because it matched Mr. K's description. Because it matched Hale's memory. Then came the final, undeniable piece. A photo. Dated. Geotagged. Taken from a thermal camera at night. It showed a figure walking near a mountain ridge, far from any known settlements. The camera had been mounted on a long-range UAV. The metadata proved its authenticity. The figure was walking upright. But its proportions were off. The arms too long. The head sunken. The stride impossibly wide. And standing beside it, as if in communion, were two human-sized figures, faces blurred, dressed in traditional Afghan clothing. Locals. Not running. Not afraid. Just standing looking up. As if in reverence, as if it wasn't a monster. As if it was a god. That was the moment Hale's understanding shifted. This wasn't about isolated sightings. This wasn't about strange creatures in the hills. This was about coexistence. Codependence. There were people, entire villages, perhaps, who had known about the giants for generations. Who had lived with them, quietly, in fear or in peace, offering what was needed to keep the balance intact. Offerings. Sacrifices. Hair dyed orange. Goats painted red. It wasn't superstition. It was tribute. And Echo 7 had disrupted that. Unintentionally, maybe. But fatally. Because they hadn't just walked into a cave. They had walked into a borderland. A place where two species had made a silent agreement long ago: stay out. Stay quiet. Leave us be. And now, that pact had been broken. The twist wasn't just that the creature had existed. It was that everyone already knew. The government. The locals. The war zones had served as a kind of camouflage, chaos providing cover for something much older. And when Hale's team killed the giant, they hadn't saved anyone. They had exposed something that had always been there. Watching. Waiting. Remembering. And maybe now, no longer content to hide. If you piece it all together, not just the incident in Kandahar, but the silence that followed, the testimonies that leaked out, the strange consistency in every detail from men who had never met, you begin to see something more than coincidence. You begin to see a timeline. Not of a creature, but of a pattern. A cycle. Let's go back to the beginning, or at least as far back as anyone dares to go. Somewhere, thousands of years ago, deep in the early histories of human civilization, there were stories of giants, not just myths, not just metaphors, but detailed accounts. In the biblical texts, they're called the Nephilim. In other scrolls, they go by different names: the Rephaim, the Anakim, the men of renown. All of them described as towering, aggressive, unclean hybrids of men and something else. Warriors. Cannibals. In some tales, rulers. Many dismissed these as spiritual warnings, allegories for pride or violence. But what if they weren't metaphors at all? What if these giants weren't extinguished by flood or conquest, but driven out? Forced into the wildest corners of the world. Into the caves. The uncharted mountains. The dark. Places like Kandahar. Erase what we know. In early 2002, Echo 7 was sent to investigate a cave system reported by drone surveillance. That mission ended with their disappearance. No call-ins, no beacon, no bodies. When Hale's team was deployed to recover them, they didn't find a Taliban weapons cache or a sleeper cell. They found bones, scattered gear, signs of violent dismemberment. And then, the creature. 13 feet tall. Spear-wielding. Hair matted with red. Pale, leathery skin. Teeth like stone blades. 6 fingers per hand. 2 rows of teeth in the skull. Its behavior was not rabid. It didn't attack out of instinct or panic. It watched. It measured. And it waited until it was close enough to kill. That's not animal behavior. That's tactical. Then the cover-up began. Command extracted the body under tight wrap. No one spoke of it again. Soldiers were NDA'd. The footage was purged. The body was never seen again. So what does that tell us? It tells us that somewhere in the command hierarchy, someone wasn't surprised. Reconstructing the incident now, with all available fragments, paints a clearer picture. The cave wasn't random. It was chosen. The locals had known about it. They'd left offerings near it. Dyed goats red. Dyed their hair orange, matching the hues of fire and blood, signs of reverence or appeasement. Not out of superstition. But tradition. That cave wasn't a hiding place. It was a border crossing. A threshold between 2 worlds, the modern and the ancient. Echo 7 crossed it without knowing. And the creature responded. Not in rage, but in ritual. Think about what the team found. The bones outside the cave weren't buried or arranged. They were discarded. Like animal remains after a feast. There was no effort to hide them because there was no need. The creature didn't fear discovery. It owned that mountain. It was the mountain. That's the part that terrifies Hale the most. That it wasn't hunting. It was defending. The timeline expands further when you trace other encounters. The 2008 testimony of the CH-47 pilot matches the exact description Hale's men gave in their reports, without ever knowing each other. Same size. Same smell. Same unnerving presence. That incident predates Hale's by months. Possibly even overlaps it. Which means the creature that Hale's team killed may not have been the only one. In fact, based on satellite imaging, there were 3 separate cave networks identified within 30 kilometers of that site, all showing heat anomalies within similar timeframes. Only one was ever investigated. Only one yielded a body. So what if there were others? What if the creature wasn't solitary? What if it was a scout? A sentinel? That's where the theory turns from terrifying to apocalyptic. From there, the patterns grow more sophisticated. Unmanned drone footage in 2011 captured a similar figure walking upright in northern Kunduz province, near a known insurgent smuggling route. Again, massive size. Same slow, deliberate gait. But this time, there were others around it. Not giants. Humans. Villagers. Standing calmly. Watching it pass. Not running. Not resisting. That's not fear. That's acceptance. Possibly even allegiance. So what does that mean? It means this wasn't just an isolated predator. This was a culture. A system. One that some humans had chosen to live alongside, or beneath. And when modern forces entered that system without understanding its laws, its customs, its invisible borders, violence was inevitable. Hay raised the reconstructed hypothesis. These creatures, whether descendants of ancient giants or a divergent hominid species, exist in remote, high-altitude environments across the globe. They maintain tight, ritualized territories, often centered around cave systems. Locals, in isolated pockets, are aware of their existence and participate in ritual appeasement, dyed animals, food offerings, secluded paths. When modern forces enter these regions, the creatures observe. Not immediately hostile. But when threatened, or disrespected, they strike with precise, overwhelming violence. Afterward, they return to hiding. Confident the cover-up will resume. That history will repeat. That silence will win. And it has. Until now. Reconstruction means rebuilding events in a way that gives them meaning. But meaning here doesn't come from the facts alone. It comes from the omission. From the way every official report avoids the truth. From how command buried the mission. From the silence of the Defense Department, the sanitized public statements, the retracted articles, the broken links. From the way all those involved are still, to this day, watching their words. Hale understands now that the silence isn't just bureaucratic. It's protective. Because if the world knew what really happened, what's still happening, people would panic. Not just because giants are real. But because giants are still here. Still hiding. Still remembering. Still watching. The Kandahar creature wasn't an accident. It was a messenger. And whether it meant to or not, it delivered its message the moment Echo 7 stepped into its world. This land is not yours. This story is not over. And we are not alone. It was supposed to make sense by now. After everything Hale had pieced together, the testimonies, the footage, the photographs, the buried reports, it should have formed a straight line. A conclusion. A truth with weight and clarity. But it didn't. It curved. Worse, it folded back on itself. Because no matter how many fragments he assembled, no matter how far down the rabbit hole he followed the trail of classified whispers and redacted briefings, Hale kept returning to the same wall. Not a lack of data, but an abundance of contradiction. The kind that eats at the foundation of certainty. One day, he would be sure, certain that the creature in the mountains was part of an ancient species. A biological anomaly. A survivor of something prehistoric. But then a new story would surface. An operator from a different war zone, different decade, describing an encounter that shouldn't have matched, but did. Down to the teeth. The spear. The silence. And Hale would wonder, how do creatures like that stay hidden? How do they sustain? Another day, he'd be convinced it was a cover-up. That the US government had known for years. That black-budget research programs, things like Project Titan, had mapped their biology, tagged their habitats, studied their behavior. But then he'd find evidence that didn't fit. A mission log scrubbed entirely, not just classified, but vanished. Satellite footage altered. Comms transcripts that ended mid-sentence. Who could erase data like that? And more importantly, why? Then there were the personal doubts. Quiet, brutal ones that crept in during the long hours, when the apartment was too quiet and the TV droned in the background, forgotten. What if it wasn't real at all? What if the brain, under pressure, does something terrible? What if the human mind, in the presence of fear, trauma, isolation, invents monsters to explain what it can't understand? He had seen men hallucinate under heat stress. He had watched trained soldiers mistake rocks for mines, dogs for combatants, shadows for snipers. He had felt that break in his own mind, during the early days. That short, flickering breath where nothing is real. What if this was that, just bigger? What if the creature, the cave, the towering shape, it had all been a shared psychosis? A collective response to fear? There were moments when he could almost convince himself. Until he remembered the blood. The bones. The size of the spear. The shape of the hand. The weight of it. That wasn't imagined. And yet, there was still no proof. The body was gone. The report scrubbed. Even the other witnesses, those who once whispered with conviction, were going silent again. Messages bounced back. Forums closed. Old blog posts disappeared overnight. And when Hale tried to follow up, the people he once trusted now only gave one-word answers, then disappeared. He started to wonder if he was being watched. Or worse, forgotten. The breaking point came quietly. Not with some dramatic reveal, not with someone pounding on his door or flashing a badge. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, over a mug of cold coffee, while Hale sat at his desk staring at an encrypted folder he could no longer open. Access revoked. The label was familiar, OPFOR, KDR Incident Archive 2002. Had read those files a dozen times. But now they were gone. And with them, the last thread tying his memories to something verifiable. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all crushing down like gravity. His body felt heavy. His thoughts, numb. For the first time, he thought, maybe I dreamed it all. And that's what broke him. Not because he believed it. But because a part of him wanted to. Wanted to forget the cave. The smell. The way the air changed right before the giant emerged. The sound of Finch's voice when the spear hit him. The look on Diaz's face when they unzipped the body bag. The dry heaving silence that followed. For just one moment, Hale wished he could erase it. Like they had. But then, something happened. As he closed the laptop, a file on his desk caught the corner of his eye. Old. Creased. An incident report from another unit, one he hadn't read in months. Just before tossing it aside, he noticed something buried in the margins. A note. Handwritten. Sloppy. Not in his handwriting. It read, there were more than one. We just shot the first one. He stared at it. Then again. And the dread returned like floodwater. Not imagined. Not exaggerated. Witnessed. And erased. That night, Hale didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, lights off, fingers folded, listening to the wind scrape the side of the building like claws across concrete. The kind of sound you don't hear in the city. The kind of sound that lives in caves. And waits. There's a kind of silence that doesn't belong to the world you know. It's not the absence of noise. It's the presence of something else, something deeper. A silence that listens back. That waits. That remembers. That's the silence Hale still carries. He doesn't talk about it anymore, not to colleagues, not to family, not even to the rare veterans who ask if the stories are true. He just nods, shrugs, changes the subject. Because how do you explain that you've seen a myth bleed? That you've stood in front of something ancient enough to not fear you? You don't. You live with it. Quietly. He still wakes some nights with the shape of the cave burned into his mind, the stone walls, the scattered bones, the sudden scream that wasn't a sound, but a pressure, a war cry that came from another world entirely. The image of the giant collapsing under fire, not like a beast, but like a sentinel whose watch had ended. And he wonders, if they'd never gone in, would it still be there? Would it still be waiting? Time passed, as it does. Missions faded. Names changed. Soldiers moved on. Most of them, anyway. But that mountain never left Hale. Not really. It came back in fragments, a rusted canteen at a surplus store. A documentary about lost civilizations. A thunderstorm cracking against the side of his apartment and for one split second, smelling like the cave. It stayed with him in the way trauma always does, not just as memory, but as a presence. Something that shadows the edges of your life, not loud, not obvious, but constant. And every now and then, he'd catch a headline. Something quiet. Something buried. Patrol goes missing in remote Afghan valley. Unidentified thermal signature captured near old Soviet base. Locals report strange lights in mountainous region, no military comment. He'd see them. He wouldn't click. He already knew what they said. Or more accurately, what they didn't. The older he gets, the more Hale understands that this story was never really about monsters. It was about borders. Invisible ones. Lines drawn not in maps or treaties, but in memory. In fear. In silence. There are places in the world not meant to be mapped. Caves not meant to be entered. Names that aren't meant to be said. Not because they are sacred, but because they are still alive. That was the real lesson of Kandahar. Not that giants exist. But that they have always existed, and we were never supposed to find them. Because maybe once, a long time ago, there was an agreement. Not written. Not spoken. Just understood. You stay in your world. We stay in ours. But war doesn't respect those kinds of lines. It walks over them. Kicks down doors. Sends satellites overhead. Kills first, questions second. And maybe that's what happened in that mountain. Not a confrontation. But a correction. A reminder. That we are not the oldest thing here. People often ask the wrong question when they hear the story. They ask, do you think it was real? As if belief changes anything. They never ask the better question. Why was it hidden? Because that's the part that stays with Hale. That everyone knew. That it had happened before. That it would happen again. And yet, silence. Erased footage. Vanishing files. Testimonies drowned in ridicule or red tape. Why? Maybe because if people knew, truly knew, that monsters are real, the whole illusion falls apart. The illusion of control. Of civilization. Of progress. If people knew there were things older than empires still moving quietly through the mountains. What would that do to us? To the idea that we've conquered the world? We haven't. We've just avoided its darkest corners. Hale no longer looks for answers. He keeps the files locked in a drawer. The photos sealed in an envelope. The spearhead he recovered from the site sits under glass, mistaken by visitors for some tribal relic, a museum piece. No one ever guesses the truth. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind hits the side of the building just right, and the world feels thin, he wonders if they're still watching. The giants. The others. Whatever still walks those forgotten ranges with silent feet and eyes full of memory. He wonders if they remember his scent. And then he turns off the light. And listens for the silence that listens back. The last confirmed sighting came from Kundahar province. Late 2023. A reconnaissance drone conducting a standard overwatch loop near the Pakistan border picked up a group of human figures along a ridgeline. At first, they appeared as little more than heat signatures gathered around a fire. Standard stuff. Men. Gear. Goats. Then one of them stood up. It was tall, abnormally tall. The kind of scale that made everything else near it seem toy-like. It moved with a slow, deliberate ease, and the others, the ones that had previously seemed like humans, stood aside. Not in fear. In deference. The feed cut out exactly 17 seconds later. When a second drone was dispatched to recover the visuals, the area was empty. No fire. No heat signatures. Just wind and dust and mountain shadow. The footage was never publicly acknowledged. The pilot who reported it. Reassigned. The report. Redacted. And yet. Someone always sees. Somewhere out there, the story keeps circling back. Another village goes silent. A patrol never returns. A shepherd refuses to climb a certain trail. A child won't go near the cliffside cave. Hair dyed orange. Goats tied to trees. Rituals too old to remember, still followed without question. And those who try to understand, who try to know, inevitably vanish into the same quiet. Hale sees it now. He understands that what happened in Kandahar wasn't an isolated event, nor a breakthrough. It was a ripple. A warning. And maybe not even from the creatures themselves. Maybe the real warning is older. More human. Some truths are not meant to be brought back down the mountain. Years have passed since Hale saw the thing die at his feet. Or thought he saw it die. Now, even that memory feels less like a fact and more like a shadow cast on a wall. He never saw a body in a morgue. Never saw a report cross a legitimate desk. Only a flash of movement. Blood that wasn't quite red. A form too large for language. Then a tarp. Then silence. He's thought about going back. Of finding the cave again. Of retracing the coordinates and hiking until something answers. But he never does. Because something inside him, some part he trusts more than reason, tells him the cave won't be there anymore. Or worse, it will be. And this time, it won't be waiting. It will be watching. So he watches instead. Not the mountains. The world. He watches how stories like this still leak, even now. Hushed interviews on forgotten AM stations. Veterans on Reddit who post something strange at 3 AM and delete it by dawn. A blurry photo. A sound clip. A secondhand confession. Never the same. But always. Close. Close enough to remind him. This didn't end in 2002. This didn't start in 2002. We've just caught a glimpse of something far wider, something that doesn't need to show itself to be real. Something older than what we call history. Something that remembers before we kept records. And something that waits for us to forget again. Hey, race the part no one tells you. There's no closure in a story like this. No clean conclusion. No perfect headline. No body in a lab. No press conference. Just silence. And the possibility, worse than any monster, that the thing you saw that night wasn't the threat. It was the signal. The crack in the wall. The edge of a much larger shape. Still hidden. Still moving. Still watching from the mountains. Waiting for the next man to stumble across the line. And not walk back.